inside the minds of America's most feared prisoners. The alarm wasn't supposed to sound that night. But inside Rikers Island's East Block, it exploded like a bomb. Beep, 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 echoing through the long concrete hallway. 2 inmates were already halfway through the ceiling. Dust rained down. A metal vent shook. One of them whispered, "Hurry, the guards are coming." They had spent weeks planning this moment, timing guard rotations, studying blind spots, memorizing every shadow. And now, right when they were seconds away from crawling out of the block, the lights flickered, turned red, and the entire jail roared awake. Boots slammed the floor. Keys rattled. Radios crackled. Unit 5. Possible breakout. Move. But the 2 inmates didn't stop. One pushed himself deeper into the vent, and the other tried to lift his body up, but his foot slipped, banging loudly on a pipe. A guard shouted, "I see movement." Flashlights hit the ceiling. And just as a correction officer raised his baton and yelled for backup, the first inmate vanished into the darkness above the ceiling tiles. The second inmate grabbed the vent's edge, pulled again, and everything froze. A voice echoed from below. "Don't move. You're not going anywhere." The chapter ends right here with the second inmate stuck between escape and capture, his fate hanging in the balance. Now let's rewind to how these 2 even got this close to breaking free from one of America's most notorious jails. It all began weeks earlier. Inside the same block, quiet, hot, tense, the inmates noticed something strange during a routine maintenance check. A repair crew opened a ceiling panel and forgot to secure it correctly. The moment the workers left, the inmates exchanged a look. A silent understanding. This was their chance. The days that followed were filled with low whispers, hidden notes, and late-night tests. They used scraps from a broken bed frame to loosen screws. They timed guards who always walked slow after lunch. They watched which surveillance cameras had slight delays or tiny blind spots. Nothing too crazy happened at first, just small, quiet steps. A screw loosened here. A vent shifted there. A guard distracted with an argument down the hall. But every night the tension grew thicker. And then came the first extreme moment. While pretending to argue with another inmate to divert attention, one of the escape planners accidentally drew in the wrong officer, one known for being strict, sharp, and never missing anything. He walked up slowly, stared at them, looked at the wall behind them, then at the floor, then at the ceiling panel that was slightly, just slightly, out of place. His eyes narrowed. He stepped forward. The inmate's heart stopped. The officer reached up, lifted his hand toward the ceiling, and everything began to fall apart. The officer's fingertips were inches from the loose ceiling panel when a thunderous crash echoed from the far end of the block. A tray hit the floor. An inmate started yelling. Another started banging on his bars. Instant chaos. The strict officer jerked his head toward the noise, hand dropping from the ceiling. "Stay right here," he barked before rushing toward the commotion. The 2 inmates exchanged a silent breath of relief. They hadn't planned that distraction, but someone else had caused it at the perfect moment. Luck, or maybe Rikers itself, was on their side. When the block settled again, the inmates kept things quiet. A low-tension week followed. They cleaned their cells, played cards, kept their heads down. No arguments. No noise. Nothing to draw attention. But every night when the lights dimmed, they worked. They tightened their makeshift tools using torn strips of shirt wrapped around metal pieces. They tested the screws one by one. They memorized the sound of the officer's boots. Slow steps during the final round, faster steps earlier in the night. The ceiling became their secret doorway. The vent became their hope. And the clock kept ticking. Then came the next extreme moment, the one that almost ruined everything. It happened during a quiet afternoon. Lunch trays had just been collected. Most inmates were half asleep from the heat. A new officer walked into the block. One who didn't follow patterns, didn't follow routines, didn't even walk the same direction as the others. He scanned everything with sharp eyes. And then he stopped. Right under the vent. He stared at the floor, tilted his head like he sensed something, then slowly looked up at the ceiling. For a full 5 seconds he didn't move. The 2 inmates sat frozen, pretending to read newspapers. Then the officer stepped forward. He raised his flashlight. He pointed it straight at the loose panel. "Hey," he called to another officer nearby. "Come look at this." The inmates' hearts hammered. If 2 officers checked it, the whole plan would be discovered. Days, maybe weeks, of work gone in seconds. Boots approached. Keys jingled. The second officer arrived and looked up. "What is it?" The first officer lifted his flashlight higher, and that beam of light hit directly on the edge of the loosened panel. He opened his mouth to speak. The inmates didn't breathe. And then, a loud voice blared through the intercom. Emergency count. All staff returned to post immediately. Both officers lowered their lights, swore under their breath, and hurried out. The inmates stayed still, waiting, listening, making sure no one came back. Their plan had survived by inches again. But the close calls were stacking up. And they knew the next extreme event was coming, something far more dangerous than officers noticing event. It happened 2 nights later. The inmates quietly climbed onto their beds, reached up into the ceiling and finally, opened the vent wide enough for a full body to fit through. But as the first inmate lifted himself inside, a voice whispered from the darkness of the block. "I've been watching you." Both inmates froze. Someone else had seen everything. The voice came from the shadows near the far end of the block, low, calm, and way too close. The 2 inmates stiffened. They didn't turn. They didn't speak. They just listened. A figure stepped into the weak light. It was another inmate. Quiet type. Never talked. Never fought. Never drew attention. But now, his eyes were fixed on the open ceiling vent. He walked closer, slow and careful, like someone approaching a wild animal. "I know what you're doing," he whispered. "And you better listen, because I'm not here to snitch." The 2 inmates lowered themselves halfway out of the vent, staying ready to close it if he made a single wrong move. "What do you want?" one of them asked quietly. The silent inmate looked around, making sure no officer was nearby. Then he leaned closer. "You're not the only ones thinking about leaving this place." For a moment, everything went still. This was a low-tension moment, but the kind that felt dangerous under the surface, like a calm before a storm. The silent inmate explained that he had noticed their nightly movements, their timing, the screws, the shifts in the ceiling. He had pieced everything together on his own. And he made one thing clear. "I don't want in on the escape. I just want one thing: don't leave on a night where they'll blame it on me. That's all." The 2 planners exchanged a look. This was a risk, but it wasn't a threat. If anything, it was a relief. Someone who could have exposed everything had no intention of stopping them. They nodded. "Fine," one of the escape planners said. The silent inmate backed away into the shadows, disappearing as quietly as he had appeared. For the next few days things calmed down. The 2 escape planners moved carefully. They tested the vent again. They checked the hallway noise. They studied guard rotations more closely. Nothing extreme happened. No officers noticed anything. No inmates asked questions. No alarms. No strange looks. It almost felt like the tension had drained out of the block. But then came the next extreme moment, the one that changed everything. It was late that night. The block was quiet. Lights dimmed. Officers were doing their final rounds. The 2 inmates decided this was the night to try a dry run. No escape yet, just a quick test. One climbed into the vent. The other followed, pulling himself inside carefully. They crawled slowly through the narrow metal tunnel, using elbows and knees to move forward. The metal groaned under their weight, but not loudly enough to alert anyone. Then they reached the first junction, a place where 3 vents connected. They stopped. Listen. Silence. Perfect. They kept crawling until they reached a point directly above the officer station, where they intended to drop down on the real escape night. But something felt off. There was a faint sound. A hum. A whisper. A vibration. Then, without warning, the metal beneath them creaked sharply. A loud, heavy crack echoed through the vent. The entire tunnel shifted. And before they could move, the vent collapsed, dropping them downward. They grabbed onto the metal edges, fingers slipping, their bodies hanging directly above the officer station. Below them, 2 officers looked up. One shouted, "Hey, look up there." Flashlights snapped on. Radios crackled. Boots thundered toward the station. The inmates dangled, not high enough to be invisible, not low enough to drop without breaking bones. They were seconds from being caught. The 2 inmates dangled from the broken vent, fingers burning as they clung to the sharp metal edges. Below them, the officers were already rushing toward the station, flashlights slicing through the darkness like knives. "Get down from there," one officer yelled. But the inmates didn't move. Couldn't move. If they dropped, they'd land right in front of the officers. If they stayed, their grip would fail. The metal groaned again. This was pure, raw panic, one of the most extreme moments of their entire escape plan. Then something unexpected happened. The lights flickered. What? And then the block plunged into a half-shaded, emergency glow. Every inmate in the block woke instantly. Shouts echoed. Metal banged against bars. People yelled, "What's happening?" The chaos distracted the officers just long enough. One officer ran to check the breakers. Another shouted orders down the hallway. And in that 3-second window, the two dangling inmates pulled themselves upward, fingers slipping, arms shaking, and barely rolled back into the vent as the last portion of the metal crunched behind them. They landed inside the duct, gasping quietly, their bodies covered in dust. Below, the officers shined their lights into the vent, but the damage and shadows made it impossible to see if anyone was still inside. "Clear the block and check every cell," the lead officer barked. Boots thundered away. The inmates stayed silent, not daring to breathe. For 10 long minutes, the block unloaded into chaos. This wasn't just a low-tension moment. It was a reset, a forced pause where the inmates had to rethink their entire escape plan. When officers finally left the area, the two planners crawled slowly back to their starting point and slipped into their cell again. Their hearts were still racing. That night, everything felt like it had been shattered. But a plan like this, even with cracks, wasn't going to die easily. Over the next few days they regrouped. They fixed the collapsed vent using small pieces of metal stripped from an old locker. They reinforced the junction with cloth twisted tightly into makeshift rope. They timed officer movements even more carefully. They whispered less, moved slower, acted calm during head count, never looked at the ceiling again during the day. It was a calm, low-tension phase, but underneath it all, you could feel the pressure growing. The block returned to normal. Officers stopped checking vents. The broken section was quietly ignored, typical Rikers oversight. The inmates knew their window was opening again. But then came the next extreme moment, one they didn't see coming. It happened during a foggy early morning just before breakfast. An officer doing an unusually early sweep stepped right in front of their cell. He didn't speak. He didn't move on. He just stared inside, eyes bouncing from the beds, to the floor, to the ceiling. Then he said quietly, "You two think I don't know what you're planning?" The inmates froze. Everything inside them went cold. The officer leaned in closer. "I've been watching for a while. And you better believe, I'm not letting anybody slip out of here on my watch." He stepped back, hand on his radio ready to call it in. That was the moment everything tilted again. Because if he made that call, the entire block would be locked down instantly. And their chance at escape would die before it ever began. The officer's hand hovered over his radio, thumb ready to press the button. One call, one word, and everything would be over. The inmates' hearts pounded. The officer stepped even closer, lowering his voice. "I know you're working the ceiling. I know you've been moving at night. And I know you're getting close." Silence. The inmates stared back, trying not to show fear. Then the officer smirked, slow, deliberate, almost amused. "But here's the thing," he said. "I'm not stopping you." They froze. He leaned against the bars like he was sharing a secret. "I want to see how far you get. Every shift gets boring. But this is entertainment. Just remember one thing." He tapped his badge lightly. "When the time comes, I'll be the one waiting." Then he walked away as if nothing happened. The inmates didn't relax. They didn't smile. This wasn't help. This was danger, pure, unpredictable danger. A bored officer was worse than a strict officer. He was unpredictable. He might wait until the last second to catch them. Or he might just set a trap to see what they'd do. The low-tension days that followed felt like walking on broken glass. The inmates didn't know if the officer was watching from cameras, or from the hallway, or from the darkness behind a corner. But they had come too far to turn back. So they pushed forward. They rebuilt the collapse point, strengthened it, practiced moving faster inside the vent, prepared the final route above the officer station. Everything was ready. And then the final extreme moment arrived, the night they made their move. It was just after 2 a.m. The block was silent. The officers were tired. The bored officer wasn't on shift. It was perfect. The inmates slipped into the vent one last time. This time they moved with confidence. No hesitation, no testing. They reached the junction, crawled over the reinforced plates, slid into the tunnel above the officer station. And then, they pushed open the final vent cover. Cold air rushed in from the hallway outside the block. Freedom wasn't far, just a stairwell and a service door away. One inmate climbed down silently. The other followed. They hit the floor without a sound. For the first time they were standing outside their housing area, alone, unguarded. Their hearts almost burst from their chests. They took 3 steps toward the stairwell. Then, a single voice echoed down the hall. "Took you long enough." They whipped around. The bored officer stood in the shadows, arms crossed, smiling like he had been waiting all night. You boys really thought you were getting out of here? He stepped forward. Radios crackled. Boots thundered across the hallway. Officers closed in from both sides. It was over. The inmates were taken to the floor, cuffed, and dragged back toward the block. Not one word was spoken. Not one excuse was made. They had come closer than almost anyone in Rikers history. But almost was the key word. Their escape had failed. Zero. Escape attempts at Rikers Island don't just test the walls. They test the minds, the nerves, and the desperation of the people inside. Some plan for weeks. Some find tiny cracks in the system. Some get close enough to feel the cold air of freedom on their faces. But almost nobody makes it out. And the ones who try, the ones who crawl through vents, trick guards, and risk everything, they become part of the legend of Rikers Island. A place where escape is close, but never close enough. The hallway went silent after the failed escape. Just the echo of boots fading, and the two inmates being dragged back toward the block, wrists digging against the cuffs. But the story didn't end there. Not in Rikers. Not for them. Once they were pulled inside the block, every inmate pressed against their cell bars, watching. Some whispered. Some nodded in respect. Others just stared, because what those two had done wasn't normal. It wasn't foolish. It was unbelievable. They got further than almost anyone. The officers shoved them into holding cages near the back wall. The barred doors slammed shut. The bored officer stepped closer, shaking his head slowly. You know, he said, voice calm, almost amused, you two were 10 steps from the exit. 10. Neither inmate responded. We don't get runners that smart, the officer continued. Most give up after a week. Most don't even get through the first vent. He leaned on the bars. But you were interesting. Then he walked away. For the next hour, the block was filled with low tension. Whispers from inmates, distant radio chatter, officers pacing. Nothing dramatic. Nothing extreme. But inside the holding cage, the two failed escapees weren't crushed. They weren't broken. Strangely, they were calm. Because the attempt had shown them something important. Rikers wasn't perfect. It wasn't unbreakable. The system had blind spots, timing flaws, weak officers, lazy routines. And even though they had been caught, they had found the cracks. They sat quietly, not speaking, but thinking. Hours later, an officer opened the cage. You two are being moved, he said. Administration wants you out of here. Moved. Separated. Punished. Standard protocol after an escape attempt. But when the officers cuffed them and walked them toward the transfer area, something unexpected happened. Another extreme moment, one they couldn't have predicted. As they turned the corner toward the elevator, a group of inmates in orange jumpsuits were already standing there, hands behind their backs, waiting to be moved. When they saw the two escape planners, they reacted instantly. One inmate, someone known across Rikers for being dangerous, smirked and said, "Word is you almost made it out. Respect." Another added, "You showed us the holes." Everybody saw it. The officers looked annoyed, but the inmates weren't intimidated. Their voices stayed calm but firm. "You didn't fail," one said. "You just proved something. This place isn't as locked tight as they think." That moment wasn't violent. It wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. But it was powerful. Because it meant one thing. Their attempt wasn't forgotten. It was inspiration. As the officers forced everyone into the transport elevator, the doors slowly shut. But right before they closed completely, one inmate leaned forward and whispered, "Next time somebody's getting out." Then the elevator doors sealed with a metallic thud. From that moment, a new quiet spread through Rikers. A rumor. A spark. A blueprint for another attempt. And even though the two who tried were being moved far away, everyone knew. Their escape wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something bigger. The elevator rattled as it carried the two escape planners downward, deeper into the administrative section of Rikers Island. The air grew colder. The lights harsher. The silence heavier. They knew what was coming. A transfer. Isolation. Interrogation. Weeks, maybe months, of lockdown. But what they didn't know was what had already started happening back upstairs, in the blocks they'd left behind. While the elevator descended, word of their escape attempt spread through Rikers like wildfire. Inmates whispered through vents. Messages moved through food slots. Everyone, from the quiet ones to the troublemakers, was talking about the same thing. They got out of the block. They reached the hallway. They touched the free air. It wasn't just gossip. It was fuel that no jail wanted inside its walls. But down below, the two planners were walked into a stark, gray holding room. A folding table. 2 chairs. Nothing else. The board officer from before stood waiting for them, leaning against the wall with a tired grin. "Told you I'd be there at the end," he said. No one responded. He shrugged. "Sit." The inmates were cuffed to anchors in the floor. The officer paced slowly around them. Then he spoke quietly. "You know what the problem is with escape attempts? They don't end when the runner gets caught. They spread." He tapped his radio. "Administration is in panic mode right now. They want names. They want every detail. They want to know who helped you." The inmates said nothing. They weren't snitches, not because they were brave, but because talking only made things worse. The officer continued pacing. Meanwhile, upstairs the tension rose again, a less extreme moment but one that mattered. Officers were doing random cell searches with more aggression than usual. They were checking vents, kicking beds, flipping mattresses. Inmates kept quiet, watching, listening. Because something had changed. This wasn't a normal shakedown. This was fear. Fear from the staff. Fear from administration. Fear that the cracks in Rikers were bigger than they thought. But the real shift, the next extreme moment, was happening right below in the holding room. As the board officer circled them, the door suddenly opened. A higher-ranking supervisor walked in. No smile. No friendliness. He dropped a folder on the table. Inside were photos. Ceiling panels, vent damage, tools made from bed frames, footprints in the duct. The supervisor stared hard at the 2 inmates. "You two started something," he said. "And everyone upstairs is now looking for a way out. We're not having that." He leaned closer. "So here's what's going to happen. You're being transferred. Not to another block. Not to another wing. Silence. You're being sent to the most controlled unit in this entire jail. No vents. No blind spots. No movement." The inmates looked at each other. They had expected punishment, but not this. Before the supervisor left, he added one final line. "And I don't care how smart you think you are, you won't be escaping from where you're going." The door closed. The inmates were left alone with the board officer, who let out a slow laugh. "You hear that?" he said. "They're scared. You got in their heads." Then he leaned down and whispered, "But here's the thing. You might not be done yet." The inmates looked up. "What does that mean?" one asked. The officer smirked. "It means this jail is changing. And whenever a place changes, new cracks appear." He straightened his uniform. "And someone, maybe not you, will find them." The officer opened the door, signaling the transfer team. "Let's take them." As the inmates were let out, one thing became clear. Even in failure they had tipped something over. The balance. The fear. The order. Rikers Island was shifting. And shifts create opportunities. For the desperate, the bold, and the ones who still believed the impossible could be done. The metal door slid open with a heavy buzz, revealing the deepest isolation unit in Rikers Island, a place inmates whispered about but rarely saw. Cold concrete. Dim lights. Thick glass. No air vents wide enough for a mouse. This wasn't a housing block. This was a bunker. The transfer team pushed the 2 inmates through the corridor in silence. No other inmate voices. No footsteps aside from officers. Just the hum of electricity and the distant clank of reinforced metal. Cells here were different. No bars, only shatterproof windows. No shared space, only a concrete box and a steel door. No movement. Every inmate stayed locked down almost 24 hours a day. The officers unlocked one door. "Inmate number 1, a guard said. Inside. He was shoved into the cell. The second inmate was placed several doors down, alone. Separation. Control. Isolation. The officers knew exactly what they were doing. Once the doors slammed shut, the silence was suffocating. This wasn't like the block. No noise. No whispers. No distractions. Just breathing. And concrete. But Rikers had a strange rule. Every time the jail tried to crush someone, it accidentally revealed something useful. And that's exactly what happened next. On the first night inside the isolation unit, the lights suddenly flickered. A small, almost unnoticeable drop in power. Not enough to trigger alarms. Not enough to cause panic. Just a dip. Then another dip an hour later. Low tension. But strange. Hours passed. Then, during the 3 a.m. quiet, the inmate in the first cell heard something extremely faint coming from behind the wall. A tiny, rhythmic clicking. Not officers. Not pipes. Not rats. It was too deliberate. He pressed his ear to the cold concrete. Click. Pause. Click click. Pause. Click. It wasn't noise. It was communication. Someone else was in this unit, and they were signaling. The inmate tapped back once. Silence. Then the clicks returned, faster this time. Urgent. Precise. Someone was sending a message. He listened carefully, breaking it down, interpreting the rhythm. A simple code inmates used when they couldn't speak or see each other. The message was short. You're the ones who almost made it. His heart jumped. Someone in this unit knew about the escape. He tapped a reply. Who are you? Pause. Then. Someone who got further. The inmate froze. Further? Impossible. No one got further than the hallway. He tapped again. How far? Silence. Then. I reached the outside fence. The inmate's blood ran cold. Someone in this unit had made it all the way to the perimeter. Closer than anyone currently locked inside Rikers. This wasn't just another prisoner. This was a legend, an inmate whose failed escape attempt had been buried deep by administration. Suddenly, the entire isolation unit felt different. Not a prison. Not a cage. But a meeting point, where Rikers locked away its biggest threats. The inmate tapped again, slower this time. Why are you telling me this? The answer came fast. Because you showed me something. Another pause. Even after years, the cracks are still there. The inmate leaned his forehead against the concrete wall. Then came the final message, one that would ignite the next extreme moment. There's another way out. Silence filled the cell. His breathing grew sharp. He tapped one word. How? The answer sent a chill through him. Not through the ceiling. Not through the vents. Not through the block. A long pause. Then the clicks came slow and deliberate. The weakness is under the floor. The inmate stepped back, heart pounding. A new escape route. A new crack. A new possibility. Even here, inside the most secure unit of Rikers Island, the escape story was beginning again. The inmate stood frozen in the middle of the isolation cell, staring at the concrete floor beneath his feet. Not the ceiling. Not the vents. Not the hallway. The floor. A place he never imagined could hide a weakness. He pressed his ear to the wall again and tapped back. Show me. A long pause. Then the answer came in slow, steady clicks. Tap twice at sunrise. The inmate stepped away, heart pounding. Sunrise wasn't far, maybe 4 hours. But in a place where every second crawled, it felt like forever. The hours passed quietly. Low tension. No footsteps. No shouting. Only the faint hum of the isolation unit's fluorescent lights. When the first hint of morning seeped into the corridor, glowing thinly through the glass window of the door, he tapped twice. Silence. Then suddenly a deep sound echoed through the floor. A hollow, low thud. Not solid. Not uniform. It was the sound of space beneath concrete. The inmate's eyes widened. He knelt and gently pressed his palm to the ground. Cold. But not solid. There was something under there. Another thud came from the far end of the corridor, this time louder, sharper, like metal hitting metal. The inmate in the other cell tapped against the wall. Crawl space. Old maintenance tunnel. Abandoned. A maintenance tunnel? Under the isolation unit? Rikers had a history of outdated construction, forgotten shafts, old wiring channels, patched over but not always sealed correctly. He tapped back. How do we reach it? The reply came instantly, reassuring. I already started. Started? The inmate leaned close to the wall. The next set of clicks were slow, almost proud. 3 years. Hidden under the bed frame. Concrete is cracking. 3 years of work. A crack big enough to widen. A hidden floor weakness. A tunnel below. This wasn't a fantasy. This wasn't a rumor. This was real. The low tension broke into an extreme moment when the inmate knelt beside the metal frame bolted into the wall. He pushed against the lower edge where the metal touched the concrete. A tiny piece shifted. Just slightly. His breath caught. He slid his fingers underneath, and the ground moved. Not a lot. Not enough to see, but enough to feel. A small slab had been loosened beneath the bed frame years earlier, and no officer had noticed. Not one. Suddenly the isolation cell wasn't a dead end. It was a doorway. He tapped quickly. How did they not find it? The response came without hesitation. This unit is too strict. Officers checked the top. Never the bottom. It made sense. They checked the ceiling first now. Vents. Cameras. Bars. Never the floor. He tapped again. What's under it? How big is the space? The response. Big enough for one person at a time. Leads to a tunnel that hasn't been used since the 80s. The inmate's heart pounded harder. But then came the last message, the one that changed the entire direction of the story. I can break through soon, but not alone. The inmate backed away from the wall. He understood. This wasn't just communication. This was a request. A partnership. A new escape attempt that required two minds working silently together. The inmate took a deep breath, then tapped the only answer that made sense. Tell me what to do. The reply came immediately, urgent, fast. Tonight after final count. When the hall goes dark. I'll signal. We break the floor together. A small electric jolt shot through his body. Another escape attempt. But this time not through vents. Not through ceilings. Not through hallways. This one was going underground. Into a forgotten part of Rikers that nobody had seen in decades. As the morning light brightened the corridor, a shadow approached the door. An officer. Shift change. Key ring jingling. The officer paused outside his cell, peering inside. Looking suspicious. The inmate kept still. The officer narrowed his eyes. And then walked away. The inmate exhaled slowly. Because tonight, when the last door locked, when the lights dimmed, when the unit went silent, two inmates, isolated, separated, watched closely. We're going to attempt something more dangerous, more insane, and more impossible than crawling through a vent. They were going into the ground beneath Rikers Island. Night returned to the isolation unit slowly. Lights dimming. Doors locking. Officers finishing rounds. The whole place settling into that heavy nighttime silence that feels thicker than air. Final count ended. Keys stopped jingling. The hallway went still. The inmate sat on the edge of his bed, heart pounding in the dark, waiting for the signal. 1 minute passed. 2, 5. Then, a faint click came from the wall. Not loud. Not rushed. But clear. The signal. He slid off the bed quietly and knelt beside the bottom metal frame. His fingers found the small loose section of concrete he tested earlier. It shifted again, slightly, just enough to let him know the crack was real. He tapped back once. From the other cell, a second click responded. They were in sync. Working blind. Working silent. Working through a wall. He slid both hands under the metal frame and slowly pulled. The concrete underneath gave a soft scrape, barely audible. Low tension. He stopped. Listened. Silence. Then he pulled again, firmer this time. The metal frame groaned, but the noise was so low it blended with the hum of the lights. In the other cell he could hear faint thuds too. The other inmate working the same section of floor, breaking the crack wider from his side. Slow. Careful. Rhythmic. They moved like two halves of one plan. Minutes passed. The crack grew wider. A small piece of concrete finally lifted, no bigger than a tile, and the inmate froze. Under it lay darkness. A small pocket of empty space. A void between the cell floor and whatever lay beneath. His breath weakened for a moment. This was real. He tapped. I opened a piece. The answer came fast. Good. Keep going. He slid the tile aside and reached into the gap. Cold air rushed up. Not fresh air. Old air. Stale. Still. But it was space. Space big enough for fingers, then a wrist, then. He pulled at a second slab. This one resisted, then popped loose with a soft thud. Another piece. Another opening. The hidden flooring was giving way. Then the next extreme moment arrived. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Approaching the isolation unit. The inmate snatched the loose tile, slid it halfway back into place and dropped onto the bed, pretending to sleep. The footsteps grew louder. Nearer. A flashlight beam swept under the door, slicing across the floor. The inmate didn't move. Didn't breathe. The light hovered. Stayed longer than usual. As if the officer sensed something was off. Then, after a tense, silent 10 seconds, the beam moved on. The footsteps faded. The inmate exhaled silently, chest trembling. When the hall quieted again, a new click tapped through the wall. Keep going. We're close. He returned to the floor, lifted the second slab again and reached deeper. His hand touched metal. A rusted pipe. He slid his fingers along it until the pipe curved downward, into a larger hollow space. A tunnel. The real tunnel. He tapped. I feel it. The answer almost shook him. Pull the last slab. That's the entry. He worked quietly, pushing against the third concrete tile. It was heavier than the others, but the crack underneath weakened it just enough. He twisted, lifted, shifted. Then, with a slow grinding sound, the tile rose. Beneath it was a narrow drop about 2 feet deep, leading into darkness. A flattened cement ledge stretched beyond it, the top of an old tunnel wall. And a faint, dusty breath of stale underground air filled the cell. It was real. An escape route hidden under the isolation unit. He tapped almost urgently. "It's open." The reply came instantly. "Good. Be ready. The hard part starts now." Then a final tap. "Tonight, we go down." The inmate stared at the dark hole beneath the floor. A new escape attempt. One more dangerous than the ceiling. More claustrophobic than the vents. More unpredictable than the hallways. Was officially beginning. The darkness beneath the floor felt alive. Heavy, stale, silent. The kind of silence that makes your heartbeat sound like footsteps. The inmate stared into the narrow opening. This was it. The final chance. Not through ceilings. Not through vents. Not through hallways. Underground. He tapped the wall. "Ready?" A single tap replied. "Go first." He grabbed the edge of the floor, took one deep breath, and lowered himself into the opening. His shoulders squeezed. His ribs scraped concrete. He slid deeper until his feet touched the narrow ledge beneath. Then, thud. He dropped gently into the tunnel. Pitch black. Dust everywhere. Barely enough room to crouch. He looked up through the small opening as the second inmate's hand appeared. He reached up silently, guiding him down. Now two were standing in a forgotten passage. A tunnel abandoned decades ago, never mapped in the current security logs. They moved forward slowly, dragging their feet through dirt and old wiring. Every sound echoed. Every breath felt loud. Low tension. But rising. After 10 feet, the tunnel widened into a small chamber. A rusted grate blocked the next section. The inmate tested it gently. The metal shifted. Weak. Breakable. He lifted. The grate groaned. Just loud enough to echo back toward the cell above. They froze. Listened. Silence. Together they lifted again. This time the grate snapped free with a crack that echoed down the tunnel like a warning. Extreme tension surged. They had seconds to move. The inmates slipped through and followed the tunnel deeper. Past crumbling walls, old pipes, and forgotten maintenance routes. Then a faint hum. A vibration. A light ahead. They stopped. A metal door. Modern, reinforced. Installed years after the tunnel was abandoned. Blocking the only exit. The inmate tapped the wall beside it. Hollow. Thin. Possibly breakable. He nodded to the other. Together they pushed. Concrete cracked. Dust rained. The wall buckled. Cracked. A piece broke free, revealing a thin crawl space leading upward. Straight into the back of a storage room. Connected to the administrative wing. Freedom was only steps away. They crawled quickly, hearts slamming inside their chests. Then, slam. A door above the crawl space opened. Footsteps. Officers. Voices. Checking all auxiliary rooms. They said the isolation floor detected movement. Movement. They had triggered something. The inmates stayed perfectly still, pressed inside the crawl space as light from a flashlight beam skimmed the floor above them. A radio crackled. No signs here. Move to the next section. Footsteps drifted away. Silence. This was their moment. They pushed upward, lifted the loose storage grate, and slid into the empty room. For the first time in days, they were outside of their cells again. They looked at each other. And without speaking, they moved. Down a hallway. Past a supply cart. Toward a side exit door used only by night maintenance crews. The door had an alarm wire. But the inmate who reached the outside fence years ago knew how to slip it. He pulled gently. Twisted the wire. Slid the latch. Click. The door opened. A rush of cold night air washed over them. The outer perimeter was ahead. Fences. Floodlights. Guards and towers. Escape? Possible but risky. They took one step outside. Sirens exploded. Red lights flashed. Officers yelled from behind. Floodlights ignited the yard like daylight. The two inmates ran. Fast. Hard. Through the cold. Through the mud. Toward the fence. But Rikers was awake now. And everything that could stop them was already moving. A gate slammed shut. A guard shouted. Dogs barked. Officers swarmed. The inmates reached the fence, grabbed the wire. And then, freeze. Now. Hundreds of lumens hit them at once. A spotlight so bright they couldn't see. They let go of the fence slowly. Hands lifted. Officers tackled them to the ground, cuffed them, and dragged them away from the perimeter. No words. No fight. They had reached the outside edge of Rikers Island. Closer to escape than almost anyone in modern history. But the island swallowed them again. Escape stories inside Rikers never truly end. Even when the runners are caught, their attempts leave shadows that spread through the jail. New rumors. New courage. New cracks in the system. New inmates who whisper. If they almost did it, maybe someone else can. Those two inmates didn't break free. But they broke something bigger. The illusion that Rikers Island is unbreakable. And somewhere in some dark block, someone is already making plans, studying the walls, watching the guards, and waiting for the next moment the island lets its guard down. Because the truth is this: as long as Rikers exists, someone will always try to escape it.